Orders of the day.
Ballot item number 30, Order M31, second reading of Bill 31, an act to amend the Employment Standards Act 2000 to entitle an employee whose child has died to a leave of absence. Mr. Tabuns.
Pleased to recognize the member for Toronto-Danforth.
Thank you, Speaker. Speaker, I move second reading of Bill 31, an act to amend the Employment Standards Act 2000 to entitle an employee whose child has died to a leave of absence.
Mr. Tabuns has moved second reading of Bill 31, an act to amend the Employment Standards Act 2000 to entitle an employee whose child has died to a leave of absence. Pursuant to Standing Order 98, the member has 12 minutes for his presentation.
Thank you, Speaker. Speaker, before I talk about the bill before us, I want to recognize Vince and Espy Leitao, who are the parents of Jonathan, the young man that this bill is named after. Speaker, there are many things that we don't want to think about in our daily lives, and one of those is dying. We don't want to think about it, but even more difficult to think about, Speaker, is the loss of a child. However, it does happen. We do have to think about it. We have to think about the parents, and we have to think about the sisters and brothers of the children who we've lost. We have to think about those who remain and the emotional burden that they carry. We have to think about what we as a society can do to help because, and let us be very clear about this, Speaker, we can't simply abandon people. The bill before us is not a complicated one. The bill amends the Employment Standards Act 2000 to provide that an employee who has been employed by his or her employer for at least 6 consecutive months is entitled to a leave of absence without pay of up to 52 weeks if a child of the employee dies. In effect, it gives grieving parents the ability to take time from work without the additional fear that they could lose their jobs. I was first approached about this bill by one of my constituents, Megan Ferris-Miles, who'd lost her 3-year-old son. And in an email to me, she set out the situation very clearly and made the suggestion that I come forward with this bill, and I'll just quote her. I've spent some time with many parents who have also suffered the tragedy of losing a child, and one of the things that binds us together is the struggle with balancing work and grief as we adjust to our new normal. One of the parents that I have met is seeking to implement changes to the Employment Standards Act to provide 52-week leave of absence for bereaved parents. His name is Vince Leitao, and he's lost his teenage son Jonathan to cancer a little over 1 year ago. She wrote, "As you know, there is currently a critical illness leave whereby parents can take up to 37 weeks off work to care for an ill child. And there's also a leave of up to 104 weeks available to parents that lose a child as a result of a crime. However, there is a huge gap for parents whose children have a terminal illness or fatal injury. In these cases, parents are only eligible for up to 10 days of personal emergency leave. Then they're left to the mercy of short-term disability plans or the benevolence of their employers. It's absurd that the law recognizes the need for a parent to be with their child as they face a critical illness, but then upon the child's death, they're expected to return to work almost immediately. Similarly, it does not make sense that the law provides up to 52 weeks for maternity and parental leave to facilitate the bond between parent and child. But when the natural order of life is turned upside down and the child dies, there's no similar leave." Megan set it out clearly and plainly. The emotional impact of this is difficult to comprehend. When I was preparing to speak to this issue, I found that I had to hold myself in emotionally because if you go too deeply into this, it is extraordinarily difficult to manage. But I think about those parents who are dealing with the unthinkable, the state of shock, the state of loss that they're going through, and the fact that not only are they dealing with that loss and that shock, but they have to think about how they will continue at work, how they will be productive, when, frankly, Speaker, even thinking things through clearly in that state of mind is extraordinarily difficult. It's easy to understand that a person would not be social, let alone productive, for months after the loss. Now, Mr. Leitao worked with a lawyer at Sick Kids Hospital to do a first draft of this bill and sent along a more academic but still moving explanation of what is at stake and what is under consideration. And I'm going to quote because I don't think I can put it any more clearly. The death of a child is one of the most painful events that an adult can experience and is linked to complicated and traumatic grief reactions. For parents, the death can result in severe anxiety and other negative emotions associated with loss. For most parents, the child's death precipitates a severe crisis of meaning, as the death represented an unnatural departure from the order of life's events. The time course for parental grief is uncertain and can be expected to show great variability. Research suggests that to the extent one can identify a typical timeline of grief, it begins with shock and intense grief for 2 weeks, followed by 2 months of strong grieving, and then a slow recovery that takes about 2 years. However, recovery does not mean closure, nor an end to grieving. Many of these parents do not feel they're emotionally, mentally, and perhaps physically ready to return to the workplace. They may not feel they're able to function effectively, or they may not feel prepared to face questions or even sympathy from those who have not suffered a similar loss. For many parents, the only solace is in associating with those who have suffered a similar loss, especially in the first months following death. And I want to say to you in this chamber that when a parent goes through a loss like this, they absolutely must have time to heal. Unfortunately, what's currently on offer is not adequate, and I will continue the quote from that communication I was reading. The Employment Standards Act 2000 provides statutory protected leaves of absence for parents whose child dies as a result of a crime for up to 104 weeks, and leave up to 52 weeks for parents whose child has disappeared and it's probable that the disappearance was linked to a crime. However, for a parent whose child dies as a result of a traumatic event such as an accident or suicide, or as a result of a sudden or prolonged illness, the grief is no less palpable, and the death may be as unexpected, and even if expected, as impossible to prepare for emotionally. Yet, for these parents, there is no such statutory protection for leave from the workplace in order to grieve. Their grief is deeply discounted under the Employment Standards Act. It is expected that they may take 10 personal emergency days under the Act and then return to work. If they don't feel they're ready, they must make show that they qualify for medical leave. In other words, they must pathologize their response to their loss in order to show it meets the standard of mental disorder. Alternatively, they may have to file a human rights complaint on the basis of family status. Once again, they must justify their inability to work and prove their employer's duty to accommodate them. Adding insult to already grievous injury under the Employment Standards Act, parents who have been granted time off under the critically ill children leave must immediately end the leave on the death of their child. Speaker, the Employment Standards Act needs to be amended so as to allow parents whose children have died, and it is not a result of their own criminal act, 52 weeks protected leave under the Employment Standards Act. This is both equitable and compassionate. The numbers are not sufficiently large to pose an unfair burden on employers. The Pediatric Death Review Committee cites that the average number of child deaths in the province of Ontario between 2005 and 2011 is 1,122. Speaker, you need to know that this bill is supported by the Bereaved Families of Ontario, who wrote us a letter of support last year. And I'll read from the letter from Carolyn Baltaz, Board Chair, Bereaved Families of Ontario. It's my pleasure to write a letter on behalf of Bereaved Families of Ontario and our 11 affiliates in support of the proposed Jonathan's Law brought before the Legislative Assembly. We are a not-for-profit charitable organization that offers peer-to-peer grief support to bereaved parents when they experience the death of a child at any age. We believe grief support helps bereaved parents feel less isolated and better equipped to deal with everyday life in regard to relationships, returning to work, and their mental and physical health. Grieving is hard work for both the mind and body, and we know the journey bereaved parents take after suffering the death of their child is a long and winding road. Parents returning to work while still in the initial shock of their child's death adds many layers to their grief. We support this initiative as we believe the protected time offered under this bill will help our parents return to the communities productive and engaged. Speaker, I have a clear memory of the first parent I knew who'd lost a child. I was in my mid-20s. Jennifer's son, aged 8, had died from leukemia. Her son was a little red-headed guy with tremendous energy, kind of kid who seemed unstoppable. Jennifer was a strong woman, a single mom. And I remember walking down Bain Avenue in my riding. It was a cold day, it was late March, and Jennifer was out in her front yard digging up the flower bed. This was a week after her son had died. She was preparing for the return of the son, the return of life to our community, to her home. That day was cold and it was raw. I remember stopping to commiserate with her, and at the time, and even decades later, I was struck first by the extraordinary and intense grief that she was grappling with, and I was also struck by her resolve, equally strong, to prepare for the return of life. I say to you, Speaker, that we need to help all those parents who've suffered a great blow and are now preparing for life to come back. We need to change the law so they can collect themselves, rebuild their strength, and fully re-engage with life. Speaker, obviously I will ask everyone present in this chamber to vote for this bill. But Speaker, I also ask the government to use its power to either move this bill forward through committee and to third reading, or bring in its own legislation. I'm not picky. I just want to make sure that parents who deal with this have the full support of society and the opportunity to heal themselves. Thank you, Speaker.